Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Black and White Review. This is going to be a special edition episode because I've got our good friend from the Twitterverse. He has essentially hopped over to the YouTube sphere now to collaborate with us here. Rav from Juventuslive. How are you, Rav?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm honored and privileged to be part of this. So thank you.
Awesome. So the cool thing about this series, like I said, it is Daveless for the time being. Dave will probably come in later episodes, but the reason is if you guys caught last episode, we're talking about the Alliance with Kevin because Kevin is at the Alliance, and this episode was might be controversial, might not be controversial, just due to how Juventini feel about him, but Paulo Dybala, because again, he's doing quite well at Roma. His stats are progressing a lot better. He's playing a lot more. And it was interesting because we had a couple of questions. One question that was directed in one of our podcasts, should we have kept Paulo Dybala? So why not do a review on Paulo Dybala where we're going to go over Dybala's days at Palermo before he moves to Turin, his move to Juventus, I think his crowning achievement, which is roughly, I would say, the Barcelona game, the Ronaldo effect, how Ronaldo shaped his game, and then kind of more so the twilight of his Juventus career with we like to mess around with Jorge Antun and call him the snake oil salesman, and then essentially his final game at Juventus. So getting ready on that, let's start about when Dybala was a youngster or a wee little whippersnapper. Rav, how do you want to start that?
I'm looking at when he began his career, which is obviously back in Argentina. I believe I think it's Instituto de Cordoba. I believe that's how it's pronounced. It kind of caught the attention of, I think, a number of clubs back then. It was back in 2011. Scored 17 goals in, I think it was about 30 or 40 games. Grabbed the attention of Palermo, who have that kind of reputation of getting those young talents, particularly from South America. They always have like a pretty good track record of sort of getting these young players at reasonably decent prices and then bringing them over to Serie A and then capitalizing it and making a decent profit. And of course, he makes a switch over. I think the early sort of couple of years, he's finding his feet. He has 2 seasons where I think he averaged around about sort of 4 or 5 goals. He's finding his feet. He's not quite there yet, but he's playing quite frequently. And then you have that season, the kind of defining season, 2014, 2015, when he just literally explodes. I think he was playing alongside, I think it was Franco Vasquez at the time. They kind of formed this incredible partnership, the two of them. And to my shame, I remember looking back and thinking, I really want Vasquez. The Dybala looks really decent, but I think the other guy is the guy that we should go for. And then, of course, he sort of scores, I think, 13 goals or 14 goals in about sort of 35 games. And it wasn't just about the goals. It was more about the versatility, the style of play that he had in those early days. Those kinds of teams, they tend to sort of play without fear sometimes because as long as they're not relegated, they're kind of happy to sort of, just kind of play with the handbrake off. And I think you kind of got a good idea in that first season of the kind of player that Dybala was going to be. And and we luckily kind of capitalized on that.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because back in his Palermo days, Palito, he was kind of a segunda striker in a sense. Again, paired with Vasquez up top, where once we start getting more so into his Juventus career, it kind of shifts kind of the thing. Because like the one thing, guys, that I kind of want you to kind of understand is like think of this as a pyramid where Dybala is at the position of the pitch at the top, so the second striker. And then as we go a little bit further down, he almost kind of starts shifting a little bit lower down the field, and then essentially becomes kind of a pseudo right winger. But an interesting stat, or I would say an interesting note, is Franco Vasquez currently is playing at Parma, which is interesting because so crazy thing for him. So he stayed at Palermo until 2016, and then essentially even though he was at Palermo, he was on loan from Rayo Valencia until he went to Sevilla eventually and then back to Parma. So he didn't, fortunately for him, he didn't really pop off as much as people were expecting him. Because I remember those two were, Paulo and uh, Vasquez, were hot commodities, really hot commodities. And going on to the next section, because a young rising Argentinian striker who was going to essentially then move on to replace an aging Argentinian striker. So the next segment's going to be Paulo Dybala and his move to Turin.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the circumstances of him moving to Juve at that particular time. Like you mentioned, Tevez is on his way out. Pirlo is leaving to go and play in MLS. You've got Vidal leaving as well. So you've got a lot of the players that were kind of fundamental to that period of Juve's success all moving on. And instead, Juve are opting for this kind of young, like you said, like a young sort of whippersnapper. They're taking quite a big gamble for a club like Juve, who traditionally don't really have this reputation of sort of investing heavily in youngsters and then bringing them in and letting them play. And man, does he just kind of prove everyone wrong. He comes in that first season along with Mandzukic. Juve, I think we were still kind of playing that sort of 3-5-2 at times, but ultimately you had that kind of striking power up front. And like you rightly said, he's playing more as a second striker. So the Dybala that we got to know all those years later, where he kind of plays in different positions and he's sort of dropping deep and he's kind of playing as like almost like what they used to sort of call like a fantasista, the kind of player that can sort of unlock things and play all over the pitch. He's got a more defined role when he comes to Juve, but it's incredible, his contribution. I think he got something like 23 or 24 goals in that first season, with all that pressure, with all that focus on him. And it's just incredible, the contribution that he makes, the work rate, the ease with which he manages to score goals, the way that he kind of manages to unlock defenses. I think it was a lot of expectation. It was a lot of focus on him. And he could quite easily have sort of wilted under the pressure, but he just took it and ran with it.
I think my most memorable Dybala goal was the first goal against Bayern Munich in the Champions League that led to the Storaro karate kick that equalized that game. But I thought it was just interesting because we were down 2-0, and then you just see this thump from Dybala, and you're just like, okay, all right, great.
Yeah.
But, it's interesting because Dybala came in and took the 21 from Pirlo, essentially, when Pirlo left, took that up. And an interesting thing about Dybala when he first came back into in his first season with us, 2015, 2016, he actually came on as a 61st minute substitute for eventual departure Kingsley Coman against Lazio in the Supercoppa Italia, and actually got the second goal in that match in the 73rd minute. So actually quite the debut in the Supercoppa and getting a goal as well. So and then it transitioned, despite having a disaster start to that season, he got his first goal of the season against Roma in the 2-1 defeat to Roma. But here's something, because you also mentioned about the goals that he scored. He had a ratio of a goal every 151 minutes, which was far superior than Carlos Tevez' goal scoring ratios in their debut season with Juventus. And it actually matched Alessandro Del Piero's. So quite, again, like you said, quite like you said, Dybala came in with the pressure on him and excelled. But I think the next topic that we want to talk about next is essentially the ascension of Paulo Dybala. Some people like to say it's the Barcelona game or the Messi comparisons, but we're going to move on to the 2016-2017, which is essentially when Dybala became a household name.
That particular game, I think it was the season, the one where it was 2016-17. That was the Barcelona game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was explosive. That was absolutely explosive. That was, I think, again, going into those kinds of games, Juve still had that sort of, I don't know if it was the players that had this sort of not quite an inferiority complex, but sort of this kind of vibe of we're always going to be the underdogs because we've always kind of failed in the Champions League. So we always go into it with kind of a sort of a low level of expectation. And we're playing against Barcelona, who obviously beat us in the Champions League final not that long prior to that game. I think, again, I remember that the sort of feeling was that, okay, if we can kind of get a draw out of this, or we can kind of snatch a goal on the counter, and instead you have this kind of masterclass from Dybala, this incredible sort of the things that came to sort of define his game during those seasons. You see that on display against Barcelona. You have that brilliant opening goal where he literally just kind of takes one touch, cuts between two defenders and sort of curls it. And I watched that goal again today, and I still don't know how he had the presence of mind and the thought and the speed to be able to perform that in such a short space of time. It takes a special kind of player to be able to do that. And then you have the second goal, which just kind of steals it. But again, that was more kind of like brute force. That was more Dybala kind of sprinting, playing instinctively, just shooting straight away. Again, that entire performance, I know we spent a lot of time just kind of playing on the counter, but when you had a player like Dybala, who is so instinctive at times, when he was still in those early seasons, when he was playing in that role, so much of what he did was just kind of just click, click, score, score. There wasn't much thought process. There wasn't too much time sort of camped out in the opposition's half. It was just him taking one or two touches and shooting, just kind of looking up, bang. And yeah, that was an absolutely incredible evening. One of my favorite games of all time.
It's gotta be. I mean, for me, it's I remember seeing that. I was in the uni, and me and a bunch of people. I was the only Juventus fan filled with a room full of Barcelona fans, and I remember that pass that Dybala received from Cuadrado or Alves, actually, Alves or Cuadrado, and I'm thinking to myself, because you see Dybala pivot on his plant foot. I'm like, there's no way. There's no way. He shoots it, and he's able to curl it around Sergio Roberto, around PK, and into the bottom left corner, right out of the reach of Ter Stegen. I went nuts because that was just unbelievable. Even the second goal where he's just running up and he just thumps that into the corner. And the interesting thing, and you could look at a lot of folks at the time, journalists, all of them, essentially, that was when Dybala was touted as the next Messi in a sense, and it was interesting because Messi was kind of dropping into that playmaking role where Dybala kind of started doing that. So, kind of remember, as I mentioned in the earlier segment of the video, where Dybala started up as a second striker and then he starts transitioning. So, in the 2016-2017 season, Allegri kind of started to understand that the 3-5-2 wasn't working quite well. Just due to the personnel that he had, and it wasn't a good fit for the team that he had at the time. So what he does was he opts to switch out for the 4-2-3-1. And instead of Dybala being a segundo striker, he essentially becomes an attacking midfielder that played behind Higuain, to Mandzukic to his left, and then either Cuadrado or Dani Alves to his right. This was, again, before Cuadrado was converted into a right back, and Dani Alves is hands down the most offensive right back I've ever seen in my life. So it worked. For that season, it worked perfectly. So it was interesting because he saw a decrease in his goal scoring output, but you saw an increase of his defensive capabilities and his creativity. And to be honest with you, I think that's probably my favorite position I've ever seen Dybala play. Despite the night in Cardiff where a lot of players kind of disappeared and kind of just went into the mist per se. It's that I always call that game an anomaly because that game was just so weird for me. But uh, the interesting thing is after that, Dybala starts the 17-18 season without missing a step, really. I mean, a dominating hat trick against Sassuolo, where it was almost like a perfect hat trick: free kick, open play, and a penalty. I mean, just a beautiful hat trick against them. He got another hat trick against Genoa, which Dybala was absolutely on fire. Again, he literally looking like he was at that point becoming the world's greatest player at the time, the next world great, next Ballon d'Or candidate. So kind of now the next segment that we'll cover is essentially where Dybala kind of goes into a negative spin. So moving on to the next segment is essentially the Ronaldo effect to a sense, and a little bit prior to the Ronaldo effect. So I'm going to kind of mention this. So this kind of happened during the 17-18 season, but I know there was an article with Nedved because Dybala was recently dating forgot her name, unfortunately, but she was dating one model at the time before he switched over to his new girlfriend that he currently has. And in between those two times, you kind of actually noticed a performance dip from Dybala where Nedved and Allegri were saying, hey, Dybala's got to refine himself, kind of get himself back into his mojo. But the interesting thing was he was able to find it because, again, in the Champions League round of 16 against Tottenham, down 1-0 in Wembley, and it was Dybala and essentially Higuain that essentially salvaged that tie for Juventus, and essentially capped off a pretty solid season for Dybala. So moving on to the next section is essentially what happened to Dybala with Ronaldo.
Hmm. I think one thing that I'll say right off the bat, I don't know if I'm biased in saying this, but I feel like no player kind of suffered, and I say suffered in kind of quotation marks, as much as Dybala, in the sense that we had someone who played in a really specific role and he was so good at it. Like you said, he played as a second striker. He needed to have a kind of a traditional number 9 to play off. And it just worked. Like his numbers kind of tally up with that, sort of averaging 22, 23 goals for those first couple of seasons. Then you have this kind of change where the sporting directors are going out and buying these players because they are market opportunities or because they think that they may have some kind of resale value or whatever the reason might be. And then you're kind of left, Allegri's kind of left with trying to sandwich all these players into the starting 11, keep everyone happy. And Dybala is kind of the one that suffers because we go, like you said, from this kind of 3-5-2 to we're essentially not playing with a sort of a top two. And we have this sort of 4-2-3-1 with Dybala playing this sort of free role. And I remember at the time there was all this talk about Dybala being compared to Messi. Like, can he be Messi for Argentina? Can he be the Messi for Juve? Can he play this free role where he's given kind of carte blanche to drift left and right and play as an attacking midfielder, play this, play that? And he wasn't that kind of player. And like you say, we bring in Cristiano Ronaldo a couple of seasons later. And I hate to say it, for as good as Ronaldo was, I think so much of our game plan back then revolved around get the ball to Cristiano and see what he can do. If he can't do anything, then there's other players that can kind of fill in and do something in his sort of absence or when he's being marked or whatever. And again, I think Dybala was someone who, on the surface, was very happy. He was always joking. He was always talking about his relationship with Cristiano. But on the pitch, you could see he suffered. He didn't have the same kind of space. He didn't have the same opportunities. His role was completely changed. And as a result, like you say, there were obviously a couple of things off the pitch. There's some injury issues. But that dramatic change in role ultimately, I think, was the start of not necessarily his downfall, but a significant drop-off in his numbers.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too is kind of going again at the formation totem pole that we were talking about earlier. Dybala switches to a right wing in this season, or kind of towards the tail end of the 17-18 season, where Allegri opts for the 4-3-3, which was interesting because and in hindsight, it never made sense to me. I mean, it makes sense with Ronaldo coming into the team. Ronaldo's a left winger. Ronaldo wanted to play on the left wing, didn't want to be a solo number 9. But it's just you bring up really great points on that, how it threw Dybala off his game, essentially. And the thing is like in this 18-19 season, we noticed that without Ronaldo, Dybala actually excelled. There was a hat trick against the Young Boys that he did in the Champions League when Ronaldo was suspended. But the thing is that even like, for example, in the Sarri season, where essentially Dybala was converted into that falso nueve, where we kind of saw Dybala in that center role where it really started working for him, because essentially what Sarri would do is he would play Ronaldo on the left, Dybala in the middle, Douglas Costa or Bernardeschi on the right. And you kind of saw it work for Dybala a little bit better. But it's kind of like how you say it was almost the same issue that Dybala has at Argentina, though a lot of people kind of understand as well, is at Juventus, Ronaldo occupied the same space as Dybala. In Argentina, Messi occupied the same space as Dybala. So for him, I think it was kind of unfortunate for Paulo that he was really kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place in theory, because he's literally stuck in between two of the greatest players to ever touch the game. And it's again, you're Dybala. If Ronaldo says, "Hey, I want this part of the field," who are you to say no? In a sense, you can't. When essentially he's the big guy of the team, because again, at the time it was Dybala, but then when Ronaldo comes in, it essentially switches from Dybala's team to Ronaldo's team. But finalizing this segment before we transition to the next one, Dybala's final year with Juventus. We like to call this segment the agent and the armband.
That was, yeah, that was a kind of a tough season, I guess, to sort of experience, knowing what was going on sort of behind the scenes and knowing that this contract negotiation was sort of dragging on. By all accounts, the guy that he ended up having represent him, Jorge Antun, was, from what I remember of the time, I think he was a used car salesman who didn't have all his badges and or didn't have the right accreditation to sort of be able to operate as an agent. And I hate to say it, but I think we kind of saw that firsthand in the sense that there was so much confusion over what was happening. There was this constant talk of sort of going back and forth, back and forth. I think with Dybala and that last season, I think so much of it, not necessarily focusing on what was on the pitch, but I think what was happening off it was kind of this perfect storm of Juve being in this difficult situation, choosing to invest heavily on Vlahovic, choosing to kind of take a different direction. There's issues in terms of finances. Ronaldo's left. They're trying to consolidate. They're kind of being pulled in all these different directions, and they need to sort of make a definitive decision. And one of the sort of the kind of byproducts of them making this decision of, right, we're going to invest heavily in Vlahovic and we're going to try and build a team around him is, okay, well, Dybala doesn't form part of that. And ultimately he ends up having to sort of be sacrificed. I know it still divides a lot of Juventini. You ask Juventini, people are very, very kind of like, it's sort of black and white. There's no kind of grey area on it. I think the situation could have been handled better. Personally speaking, I still have a fondness for Dybala. I wish he was still at the club to a certain extent. But yeah, it just seemed an absolute mess. I think we got a fraction of maybe what was actually happening. So much of it seemed to be pulled in different directions, different narratives being spun in the press. You hear different stories about, demands and this and that, but I don't feel we ever got a true story. And I think we ultimately lost a player who was incredibly keen to stay and incredibly loyal, but ultimately we ended up going in a different direction altogether.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the interesting thing about it is we like to call him the used car salesman and the Turin Giants is Jorge Antun. Just because, for example, you have reports that at the time was, hey, the 8 million was agreed but never signed because he wasn't certified, and then Dusan comes in, and then they're just kind of like, yeah, remember that verbal agreement? Yeah, it never happened. But it's interesting because that also paired into the fact that again, Allegri wanted it to be his team. I think it was a little bit too late, to be honest, in my opinion, for them to essentially say, Dybala, this is your squad. Just more so due to kind of what was going on in the balance of everything. But I know a lot of Juventini on Twitter were frustrated that, oh, this guy's our captain, but he's never around. Because again, it's almost kind of like the tale of the lesser evil, Dybala or Bonucci as your captain, and and a lot of people are just kind of like, wait a minute. But Paulo, in regards to that, the only thing I think really is, and this is kind of curious to see, and we'll get your take on this, Rav, is the whole intercommunication. Do you think that was Antun just being petty with the club and saying, hey, let me go after Inter Milan to see if Juve will budge? Or do you really think that there was some genuine interest with Inter Milan?
I get the sense there really was. I think with Marotta having gone there And given the kind of track record of how Inter was sort of going after, obviously Marotta, and then you've got Conte, and then there was some other players here and there that they were linked with. I think there was a genuine sort of sense of, let's at least talk about it. I don't know to what extent Dybala would have agreed to that. I don't think he's ever really touched on it in great detail. But I think there was something there. I don't know how far along it got, but I think there was definitely some notion that he could end up being or going to Inter at some stage.
Yeah, definitely. So now that we've kind of covered that, I think we can finalize with our conclusion here: the Dybala farewell.
Yeah, that was tough. I watched it again today, and just it got me. It really got me. I was trying to think to try and sort of encapsulate what Dybala was for me as sort of a player, and maybe for other Juventini as well. But I think what we've kind of lost is that kind of bandiera, that player who is just a symbol of the club. We had it with Chiellini for a long time. We had it with Buffon, Bonucci. Still kind of divides people. Yeah, exactly that. With Dybala, it was like, okay, he's not just like a guy who wants to stay. He's a guy who wants to take on Del Piero's legacy. He's a guy who wants to be captain. He doesn't shy away from any of this. He's so attached to the club. And it just felt like it would have been great to have that. Just one last player who is quite almost like a one club player, who stays at the club until, sort of he's in his late 30s. Maybe he goes back to Argentina, but a big stretch of his career is spent at Juve. And yeah, it just would have been nice. And he's one of the few players that have left Juve that I watch him sometimes. I see him score goals, and I just think, good for you. Unless it's against Juve, obviously. But yeah, I just he's a player who is left in not great circumstances, but I still have a lot of fondness for the guy.
Yeah, and definitely to follow up with that, I mean, he came in as a boy and he left as a 30-year-old man. Just but
Yeah.
it's kind of those things too, because it's like, I know for a large consortium of the Juventus fan base, a lot of people were drawn to the club by Paulo Dybala. Again, for example, me personally, I'm not his greatest fan. I'm not his greatest hater. For me, it's kind of indifferent. I'm a little bit disappointed because he couldn't have become what his potential was. Again, there's a bunch of existential factors that we've covered in this video of why it didn't hit that way. But for me, it's interesting because, I love the kid, especially 16, 17, 15, 16. Those were my favorite. I mean, at that point, I'm like, for these youngsters that say he is him, like Dybala was him at that at that moment. Um, but the thing is kind of to finalize here, guys, is not all players have happy endings, unfortunately. And Paulo Dybala, unfortunately for him, it fell into that thing. I'm sure plenty of people can blame Ronaldo, but hey, man, I could say this: I'm kind of happy that Dybala was part of the club during that 9-title run. I mean, that's something that's always going to be remembered in Paulo Dybala. Even though some may argue that he isn't a Juventus legend, some may argue that he is. He's still going to be remembered in the history books. I mean, the kid went through 3 domestic doubles, went to a Champions League final with us. There's no way you're going to forget about Paulo.
Absolutely. Yeah, just shy of a decade he nearly spent at the club. So yeah, I think you have to put a little bit of respect on his name.
Yep, nope, definitely. But that's our thoughts, not your guys' thoughts. Comment on the video, guys, about what does Paulo Dybala mean to you guys? And go ahead and do a good old like, a subscription, as well as head on to the Tuning Giants website so you can actually get, I believe there is a Paulo Dybala shirt on the actual website in itself. But thanks again, Raph, for joining me. And on the 3rd episode, I'm going to keep the topic a secret, so I'm not going to spoil it anymore because I spoiled the last 2. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching. Rav, thanks for being a part of this. And everybody, we will catch you on the next one.